Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's Gopher Solutions webinar. My name is Tabor Sawatsky. For those of you who are new to our webinar series, this is a monthly webinar focusing on a variety of physical education subjects and topics. Past webinar topics have included PE teachers presenting on specific activities like assessment, fitness, and classroom management. Past presenters have included Dr. Robert Pangrazi, Dr. John Medina, and Jean Blades. Our presenters have done a great job of bringing useful topics and information to the field of physical education. Our webinars will almost always occur the third week of the month. All attendees of today's webinar will receive a certificate of participation for 1 hour of educational credit. Also today, all attendees will be entered to win the Achieve Middle School Physical Education Curriculum, which sells for $699. It includes lessons for activity, skill development, and fitness, and is equipped with all the tools to make implementation simple and easy. This grade 6 through 8 curriculum features an in-depth teacher's guide, durable and convenient on-the-go lesson cards, instructional DVDs that utilize a teacher-student presentation that provides valuable visual demonstration for every lesson. Each lesson also provides goals for both physical activity and moderate to vigorous physical activity. Today's webinar is titled Exploring the Future in Physical Education with Dr. Steve Jeffries. And before I introduce Steve, I wanted to mention that you will have the chance to ask questions during the presentation. Your questions are only visible to me, the moderator, so feel free to ask questions at any time, any questions you might have during the presentation. Questions can be typed in the questions area on the right side of your screen at any time during the presentation. We'll accumulate the questions throughout the presentation, and we'll have a chance to address your questions with Steve at the end of the presentation. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our presenter, Dr. Steve Jeffries. Dr. Jeffries has taught in the Department of Physical Education, School, and Public Health at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, Washington since 1986. For many years, he organized PE summer camps for children, and inspired by his third-grade son, he created and taught a community unicycling and juggling program. Steve served 8 years as a school board director and helped to create one of the nation's first online master's degree programs for K-12 physical and health education teachers. Steve has received numerous awards and appointments throughout his career. In 2010, he received the AFERD Honor Award, and in 2013, NASB's Joy of Effort Award. He has served as NASB President and will be the 2015 Shape America President. Steve has written extensively and is probably best known as creator and publisher of PE Links for You, the online magazine for physical education professionals. Today, through presentations and essays, Dr. Jeffries is interested in stimulating discussion about the future of physical education. At this time, I will turn it over to our presenter. It's all yours, Steve.
Thanks, Tabor, and welcome everyone to today's webinar that I'm going to focus on where I believe physical education should be going in the future. I suspect we all agree that these are challenging times for the PE profession. Around the country, threatened or actual PE program or position cuts are a pretty constant message, but it's also a time of great opportunity. And today I'm going to share a vision that I think would ensure physical education succeeds into the 21st century. We all know the world is changing fast, but sometimes I don't think we fully appreciate just how fast. And on this slide, I've highlighted how the world looked 36 years ago. In 1978, much of what we think about today, or much about what we did then, we don't do today. Clearly, a lot of the technology is new, and our population's doubled. Microsoft and Apple were just getting started, and Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg was still 6 years away from being born. So obviously a lot's changed, and this makes it rather intriguing to ask ourselves what the future might look like 36 years from now in 2050. The one thing we can be certain of is that our lives are going to look a lot different from how they look today. And there are going to be a lot of unpredictable political, economic, social, scientific, and of course environmental changes that will shape our future. But for now, let's set aside the unpredictable and instead try to imagine how each of us would like the world of physical education to look in 2050. Let's consider for a moment, if we were to be successful, what would the lives of America's youth look like in 2050? Some of you probably remember NASB's PE 2020 initiative, in which we challenged people to imagine the future of physical education, and I suspect many of you contributed. Interestingly, nearly 2,000 essay writers shared a remarkably consistent vision. They imagined a world in which all young people were leading lives that were both physically active and healthy. Well, sadly, as we know, today we're still a long way from that vision. And people talk about us having an obesity crisis, although it seems to me that worsening obesity is really just a symptom of the real problem we need to resolve. Kids and adults are moving less and less, and pretty much worldwide. In fact, the World Health Organization tells us that about 2/3 of the world's population in both developed and developing countries today lead sedentary lives. And of course, many of us are also eating badly. And what's clear is that moving less and bad eating is going to have catastrophic effects on our future lives and the economy if we can't successfully change these behaviors and start getting people moving more and eating better. But how to do this? Obviously, if it were easy to get 317 million Americans moving more and eating better, we'd have done it a long time ago. And to me, it seems too big of a challenge to even think about. So I decided to take a different approach. And I thought to myself, how about we start by finding an example of what success actually looks like? Sort of the approach Mahatma Gandhi might have recommended, you know, being the change we want to see. Are there things, I wondered, that we can learn from observing a role model who is successfully leading an active and healthy, probably what we might call a physically educated life? And as it turns out, I didn't have too far to look. This is Walkin, my neighbor's dog. And it's not going to surprise you to learn that Walkin isn't highly educated. She doesn't go to school, doesn't participate in physical education classes or sports. And what she's learned about moving, eating, and being physically educated wasn't from classes, reading, television, or online media. She doesn't attend professional PE and health conferences, although I have to add, I'm sure if she had the opportunity, she would love to come to the upcoming 2015 Seattle National Convention. But despite these limitations, Walkin has for years enjoyed a great life by simply doing naturally the things she needs to do to stay healthy. She walks, runs, jumps, sometimes swims. She's not especially skilled at lots of things, but that doesn't matter because she regularly chooses to do the things she likes. And this includes not only eating when she's hungry, well, this includes only eating when she's hungry, and also she doesn't eat too much, but rather just enough of the right food she needs to balance a daily physically active lifestyle. So what can we learn from this example? Well, what I think is that we learn that Walkin, and of course many dogs and many people who all of us know, are great role models for healthy and active lives. And as we can see, the formula for leading a physically active and healthy life, in fact, isn't very complicated. Pets and people thrive when they're born, raised, and live in environments that let them follow their natural instinct to regularly move and eat the right amount of healthy food. And if, as a society, we can create this type of living environment, most people will pretty naturally lead healthy and hopefully happy lives, which, if you think about it, is a pretty simple success formula to follow. Unfortunately, it's also clear that a very different outcome is possible. When we keep dogs in a cage or tether them to short leashes to restrict their movement, they can't lead the physically active lives that come naturally to them. And in fact, they become conditioned to leading and ultimately accepting as normal lives that are very inactive. They also develop poor eating habits, which of course is exactly what we've done and continue to do to America's children. We forced them into exactly the wrong kind of living environment for them to successfully learn and practice healthy lifestyle habits. In fact, it's even worse because we've actively prevented them from being physically active. Not moving is the norm we're conditioning them to today. So how ironic is that? It's us adults who like to criticize today's young people for being lazy, who are in fact responsible for forcing this lifestyle on them. It sort of sounds to me like a new disease I sort of want to call the Pinocchio syndrome. So, in a nutshell, here's the challenge society faces today. I believe that all children start out similar to happy puppies, and then we adults force them into lifestyles that turn them into sad old dogs. Well, you're probably wondering, what does all this mean for physical education? So I'm convinced that today's physical educators have a time-sensitive opportunity to create an environment in our public schools that supports the natural desire of American youth to be active and healthy. I also think that physical educators are better qualified than anyone to prepare America's youth with the knowledge, skills, and especially the motivation to want to be physically active. But to do this, the PE profession must change. And in fact, perhaps most importantly, if we don't change, I believe we'll sooner or later be replaced by something else that works better. Today, more than ever before, preparing for a successful future depends, as Darwin told us, on our ability and willingness to change, which sounds easy, but of course it isn't. Most of us are pretty happy to talk about change as long as it's others who are doing the changing. But the evidence is clear about what happens when people don't adapt to a changing world. You just don't have to look very far for examples of businesses that failed to see change coming and were unable or refused to adapt. We can probably add Kodak to this list, perhaps the Olive Garden, and most likely, I imagine, in a few years, we can add Kmart and Sears. Similarly, there have been many people who over the years thought their jobs were secure, not realizing that what they were doing would shortly no longer be necessary in the world in which they lived. And it wasn't that they were doing a lousy job. They simply didn't anticipate change and how it would affect them. They were too focused on what they were doing, probably trying to do it well, but not looking around them. Now, does that sound familiar? For us in physical education, it's easy to look at our past and assume we'll be around forever. But in reality, nothing lasts forever. Things change. And professionally, we can probably all agree that we need to make sure that we do what's needed to stay relevant in the world of tomorrow. Answering the question, what's in our future, is, I think, very much up to us to decide, or of course, we can simply let others decide it for us. But not surprisingly, I believe that, as many others have suggested, the very best way to predict our future is to create it ourselves. So how do we get there? So far today, I've shared what I think needs to happen and why I think that professionally we need to be a part. But perhaps you've also noticed that today there are lots of other people outside of physical education who are interested in getting people, and especially children, more active and healthy. We have national groups recommending that children and youth need to be physically active 60 minutes daily. We've got national physical activity guidelines and a national physical activity plan for Americans. And in the last decade, dozens, or if we include states and cities, probably hundreds of organizations have sprung up to promote healthy and active living and are especially targeting children in our public schools. But here's where, to me, it all gets interesting. sort of where the rubber hits the road. All of these groups are well-intentioned, but they all share a common big problem. And I'm going to illustrate it with a short story. Many years ago, my wife and I had some wonderful neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Jump. They weren't college educated, but they were common sense smart. And so if I wanted to know how to do anything around our house, I'd go see Mr. Jump. He'd give me advice, he'd loan me the tools I needed. And one day we were chatting, and I was telling him about all the different college degrees today's students were taking. He patiently listened, then he looked at me with a puzzled expression and said, "But what I don't understand is who's going to do the work, Steve?" That time we both laughed, but now years later, I've come to appreciate how profound this question was. You see, it's easy to suggest solutions to any problem, but much harder to actually make change happen. And this is, I think, a fundamental problem the nation faces with today's lifestyle crisis. Who is truly capable of doing what it's going to take to get America's kids moving and eating better? Some of you will have noticed that the physical activity promoting groups I just listed are hugely popular and get great publicity, while simultaneously physical education continues to struggle. I appreciate that it's not everywhere and not everyone, but it's a struggle, isn't it? As a profession, we constantly have to defend our existence and be vigilant about threats to our programs and teaching positions. How frustrating is this? It sort of makes those of us in the profession want to scream. What's wrong with the critics? Why don't they get it? Why isn't it as obvious to them as it is to us that supporting physical education is the very best way to get kids physically active and make health the norm? So here's my explanation. Back in 1992, Bill Clinton was challenging George H.W. Bush for the U.S. presidency, and Clinton's staff were trying to decide how best to appeal to voters. They wanted to create a laser-like focus on what was most important to the voters, for everyone involved with Clinton's campaign. The message voters wanted to hear and would support. Healthcare, the invasion of Iraq, and the recession were all big issues. But after a lot of deliberation, they came up with the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." The recession and rising unemployment were hot issues. Other issues were less important. Clinton's advisors focused much of the campaign on this simple message, and he, of course, went on to win and become the next president. And I think physical education can learn from this. Let's think about the messaging we use in PE. For 30 or more years, we've worked hard to improve the quality of school PE classroom instruction. We've promoted new curriculum models. We've added standards and assessments. We've talked about new PE as if it were the solution to old, presumably bad PE. We've got millions in PEP grants, added technology, promoted integration, and much more, but still, in too many places, we don't get no respect. It's pretty strange, isn't it, that physical activity promoting organizations are flourishing while we are still floundering. But I believe it's because we stubbornly continue to stick with the same messages in PE while hoping for different results, which, of course, as many of you know, is apparently what Einstein defined as insanity. So today, I want to suggest that we need to push the pause button and rethink. It seems to me that the public simply is not interested in what physical educators are trying to sell them. Recognizing, accepting, and changing this is not going to be easy. But again, I'll share with you a couple of examples of what happens when you allow yourself to get out of touch with your customers, and in our case, potential advocates. Some of you may remember back in the late 70s and early 80s, videotape and videotape players were invented. But what you might not know is that for several years, the Japanese electronic giants JVC and Sony fought bitterly and spent millions trying to get their brand of tape and tape players to become the industry standard. Interestingly, Sony was first to create something called Betamax, which by all accounts was superior to JVC's videotape. But in the end, Sony lost the battle, and VHS tape became the standard. It turned out that despite the better quality, people didn't like the higher price, and more critically, it couldn't record the 4 hours necessary to tape an entire American football game. Betamax, we learned, was a product with great potential, but Sony badly misread what was important to customers. Here's another example of professional misjudgment, perhaps closer to what we do. If you've ever participated in karate, you'll know it's a great physical activity. It's got skills, fitness, flexibility, discipline, fun, and lots more going for it. So how come it's not taught in PE? Why is it still a fringe sport taught mostly in dingy gyms to small audiences? Well, I believe it's because karate leaders are very proud of their sport, but somewhat delusional about how to promote it. They're convinced there is only one way to deliver karate, and that is by using black-belted instructors, of which they, of course, control to ensure there are relatively few of them. To me, this type of self-serving protectionism will help them succeed in protecting a small number of jobs, but will fail to popularize karate. So I'm suggesting to you that these examples of Betamax and karate are relevant to physical education because I believe physical educators persist in trying to sell the public a product it does not want. And to make matters even worse, our messaging is perceived by many as self-serving because we keep asking for special legislative protection. Sticking to this path will, I fear, not help us to succeed and may well be responsible for our demise and eventual extinction. It simply doesn't have to be this way for physical education, but we have to think differently, both about our product and also how we deliver it. I mentioned earlier all of the physical activity promoting organizations. They're thriving as we struggle, and yet we have the one thing they need most: an effective delivery system for physical activity and health promotion to every American school-aged child. We have trained professionals who are present, prepared, and I think with some encouragement, motivated to do the work it's going to take to get America's youth physically active and healthy. The data supports this vision. There's approximately 250,000 physical and health education teachers in the U.S. located and teaching daily in the nation's 100,000 schools. They see pretty much every one of the 50 million children attending our public schools at least once, and probably more each week for about 12 years. Imagine our potential to get America's youth physically active and healthy. Ask ourselves, who is better equipped to succeed than us? It wasn't that long ago that Amazon began as a bookstore, and at that time chose UPS as its delivery system. When the growth of Amazon exploded, deciding to sell pretty much anything, it's noteworthy that it didn't try to create a new delivery system because UPS was already there and working well. PE is, I believe, similarly poised to do the work and to deliver what people want: kids to be more physically active and healthy, if only we can get beyond the box that currently constraining our thinking and handicapping our chances to succeed. The PE profession and all of us who play a role in it have to be willing to change how we think and what we do. Fortunately, what I'm suggesting is not entirely heresy or especially radical or revolutionary, because there's already evidence supporting us being the most effective professional group capable of delivering physical activity and health to children. Today, it's mostly physical educators delivering jump rope for heart in 28,000 schools, teaching kids rope jumping skills, and motivating about 7 million of them to participate. And it's mostly PE teachers who have successfully got Let's Move Active School programs in over 10,000 schools in just the past year. But I think this is just the beginning, and it's going to take a huge shift in what we teach in physical education, how we think about our jobs to succeed in the future, and how we prepare future physical educators. We can't afford to continue to see ourselves as gym teachers and limit what we do to PE class time, or I fear we'll marginalize ourselves out of employment. We have to take over responsibility for physical activity throughout the school day and connecting our kids with physical activity opportunities in the local community. It's interesting that nearly a century ago, one of the great PE thinkers of the day, Clark Hetherington, wrote that it's not what kids do when they are in our classes that's important, but what they choose to do when they're not in class. This suggestion has huge curriculum choice implications that physical educators need to think about. I'm convinced that physical educators have the capacity to transform the lives of every one of the 50 million children in our public schools and become recognized as the key to getting future American generations physically active and healthy. But to do this is going to take some bold initiatives by our professional associations and, of course, our nearly 250,000 physical and health education teachers. And this challenging vision reminded me of President John Kennedy's Bold Space Initiative in 1963. At a time when the USA and Soviet Union were engaged in a bitter Cold War and the Russians had already put a man in space, Kennedy set our nation a bold goal: to put a man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth within the decade. And he justified it by telling the American people, we choose to go to the moon and to do other things in this decade, not because they're easy, but because they're hard, and because these goals serve to organize and measure the very best of our abilities and successes. I'm suggesting to you that similar to President Kennedy, if we set ourselves the challenging moonshot goal of getting all, not just some, of the 50 million students in our schools physically active and healthy within a reasonable time frame, we'll succeed in building the foundation upon which our future will enjoy a wildly successful future. But perhaps even more importantly, create a nation in which all of our children and grandchildren will enjoy healthy, happy, and productive lives. Thank you. And please feel free to contact me directly in addition to any questions you may have today with any thoughts, comments, or suggestions about the theme of this presentation.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And just a reminder for our audience, at this time or at any time, feel free to log any questions on the right-hand side of your screen. I'm the only one who's able to see those questions, and we'll get to as many of those as we can here in the time we have remaining. First question to get us started, Steve, is from somebody who's involved in higher education and training physical education teachers, wondering how, in their experience, they're seeing decreased enrollment for their physical education teacher education programs every year. And they're wondering is how do we get or how do we maintain enrollments in those programs to generate quality physical education teachers to go out into the field? And I don't know if that's something that you've noticed, a decrease in those enrollments also or not.
Well, Felix, for you this month, we published the story about the loss of Purdue's program, which has a long and great history of preparing physical educators, and Tom Templin and colleagues wrote about the demise of the program, and if folks interested in that particular topic would want to read his article, because he sort of says they didn't see it coming. They didn't realize that the declining enrollment would have the impact of eventually the program closing. Mm-hmm. I guess my immediate thought is that if we can establish physical education as being critical to the future of American children, then clearly we are going to gain support for PE and health teachers in schools. And since we need the teachers, then we would obviously need the professional programs to prepare them. So I kind of see a relationship between the two, that if we do a better job of establishing a reason for our being in schools, then maybe that would help with the recruitment and continuation of higher ed programs.
Okay, good. And you had mentioned how physical activity in local communities is kind of an extension of quality physical education programs. And one of the questions is, in your opinion, what are some of the really good programs out there that work outside of school? And the one example that was included in the question was Fuel Up to Play 60.
One of the things I think we need to understand, and that goes back to my thinking of trying to get 317 million Americans healthy, is a nation of 50 states is really a nation of 50 separate countries, and within each of them, the whole environment is so different. So I think we need to recognize that really the solutions are going to be local solutions. And what works in Florida, where many schools don't have gymnasiums, and what works in Alaska are going to be vastly different. So I think what we're looking for, what I guess I'm hoping for, is that we can find folks who are in the schools, who are working with kids, showing how it works, creating examples of how it works where they live. And if they live in an urban environment or a rural environment, I'm sure the thing's going to be very different. So I don't think there's an obvious one group that's going to help. I think it depends where you are, and that's really the challenge for PE and health teachers, is to look at the opportunities in the environment where they're teaching, and that's going to be very different everywhere around the country. Right.
And it seems like the idea is for physical education teachers to expand their vision of their influence, and not just within the walls of their physical education classroom, but into other areas of the school and even into the community. And just a question, looking for some clarification, is that kind of where you see the role of the PE teacher going?
I think that's something really the profession has to think hard about. And over the years, we've spent quite a bit of time trying to point out differences between physical education and physical activity. And so inevitably, and I suspect as people hear me talking about promoting physical activity, there are fears that, are we just going to become like everybody else who promotes physical activity?
Right.
But I see a huge difference, and really promoting physical activity is what we do. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the kids. However, if we want kids to be physically active, we need adults who, first of all, develop a relationship with kids to help them show the relevance of being physically active, and also to prepare them with the knowledge and skills and motivation to want to be physically active. And I don't see that outside physical activity promoters who basically, and I'm not really knocking them, I mean, they're skilled at what they do, they teach certain skills. But it's really important, if we want to change behaviors, that we have adults who spend time with kids, who can help them develop the habits and the love of movement and the love of activity. And so I don't have an issue with the physical activity PE side. I see the PE teachers as being the best qualified people to get kids physically active.
Sure. And where do you see the traditional skill development fitting into the whole thing? You mentioned skill development as it pertains to physical activity. Is that the direction where you see PE going, where skill development is more related to being physically active as opposed to maybe some of the traditional skill development like, overhand throwing and things like that?
I think once again another topic that we've had quite a few debates as to should we be focused on teaching kids skills, because if we give them the competence and confidence, then we, I guess, assume that they will want to be physically active, and if they don't have competence, maybe they won't. I'm not sure it's that simple, because if we look at what people do when they're adults, probably the vast number of physical activities that people do don't actually require a high skill level. And many of them are not going to be team-oriented, so throwing and catching is not going to be a critical thing. So I guess I tend to look at it, and the example I had in the presentation of the dog, I mean, the dog doesn't have many skills. That doesn't seem to bother it.
Right.
It's quite happy doing what it can do. And I think as we look at most adults, sometimes we view physical educators as the high water mark of what it is to be physically educated. Well, we're not. We're really the exception, because many of us actually are quite skilled in lots of different things, and we love lots of different things. And as we look at the adult population, that's atypical. I mean, most people aren't widely skilled. So I tend to think it's more of an individual thing.
Sure.
And that's why I think the PE teachers have an opportunity to help their students learn whatever it's needed to turn them on to physical activity.
Right.
And some of them may love sports, and some of them may just not love sports. And you gave the example, I teach unicycling and juggling. A lot of those kids never participated in team sports, didn't like it. They love unicycling and juggling. And so I think you have to sort of think about it as an individual thing, which once again, I think to me justifies the position of a PE and health teacher, because they have the time to develop that relationship with kids and understand what turns these different kids on.
Right. I think you kind of addressed this next question, but maybe if there's anything else you want to add. This particular teacher teaches kids with Asperger's, but I think it would apply to any kids. And she talks about how some of her students dislike physical education and any form of exercise. So her strategy is to expose them to a huge variety of different things, and then hope that they kind of connect with one, and then do it when they move on. Wondering if you have any other suggestions, but I think this speaks to what you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, certainly she is far more skilled and knowledgeable about that particular topic. The thing I see us doing in education in general is that we are starting to move towards individualization. And a lot of what's happening with the use of technology in the classroom is we're not trying to present information at one level. We're trying to meet wherever the kids are.
Right.
And I think that is maybe a helpful thought for us to have in PE, is we have to meet the kids where they are rather than expect them to perform at a particular level. And, one of the challenges when we teach, and especially groups in physical education, is how do you adapt to individual differences? And far too often we choose a level to teach that's too difficult for many and too easy for the rest. And there are very few kids who are actually meeting their needs. So, that is a challenge. But there is a debate that needs to go on here, because in some senses that supports one of the things that many people have criticized, which is that PE shouldn't just be a smorgasbord of activity that you just introduce a new thing every day and hope something's going to stick. And the folks that promote the idea of skill development will say, no, you really need to get them competent and confident for them to continue. But once again, I think we have to remember that all kids are different, and what meets one kid's need probably doesn't meet another kid's need.
Right. A broad question, but I think a good one that people are probably thinking about at this point in the presentation. What, in your opinion, what is the message that should be sent to recruit students and even help parents and others to sell the importance of physical activity. And I guess when I read this question, my thought was in the terms of physical education program, you know, and the elective programs in the high school or some of the required programs in junior high, you know, to really kind of sell the audience that is the audience of the PE teacher, the students, and the parents, the importance of physical activity, and then I guess as it relates to physical education class.
Well, listening to you, it reminds me once again of the importance of messaging, and how we need to identify what it is that we are trying to sell people. And you know, I'm probably not answering the question, but it does concern me where we've spent so much time trying to get daily PE or trying to get specialist PE teachers teaching. And it's, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's as if we are trying to force something on them rather than showing them that we do this better than anybody else. And therefore, naturally, you would want to support qualified, college-educated PE and health teachers, because it's self-evident that we have the skills just by our achievements to do what is necessary to get kids active. So I mean, really, your question to me just highlights the importance of the messaging and how we've got to be a lot smarter instead of trying to force something on folks. You know, it does remind me when, you know, going to Legislative Day in D.C. that it's tough to go in and talk to legislators and try and sell them on some sort of piece of legislation that we're promoting when it has, in most instances, some sort of financial implications. On the other hand, it's pretty easy to sell them on, we want our kids to be healthier and more active. And I mean, nobody's going to oppose that.
Right.
So the smart thing is you've got to talk to them about something that they want and can see. And I guess I don't think it's that hard for parents to understand that that movement brings joy to kids' lives as well as good health.
Well, and to build on that question more specifically, the question from a teacher is how can they convince their administration the importance of a physical education program, their program, because it's perceived to be kind of a second-class academic, so not, you know, as important as maybe some of the other academic classes.
To me, that also, we have to think there about the messaging too, and we need to message perhaps differently to different audiences. As you mentioned, I served on a school board for 8 years, and I came to understand, and maybe a little slow, that schools are not responsible for kids' health. There's nothing written in the policies, procedures, the job description of a superintendent or a principal about getting kids healthy. And in fact, both they and school board members will, and did to me, say parents are responsible for their kids' health. And so I was thinking about this. I realized that we have to point out that may be true. However, if the kids are not healthy, they're not performing as well in school. And there's a lot of evidence that shows the connection between kids' health and physical activity in terms of performance and the brain science. And I think that's probably the messaging if we're trying to talk with superintendents and principals whose jobs are measured by the academic achievement of their kids. In that particular instance, we probably do need to start talking about how this is going to not only get kids healthy, which is a good thing to have, but more importantly, from their perspective, it's going to help the kids do better in the classroom. And so that's a messaging difference. And I think in the past, and I know my experience was, folks would come before the school board when I was there, and they'd ask for things and they were passionate about things, but they didn't understand that that wasn't the responsibility of school boards, principals, and superintendents. So once again, you've got to think about what is it that interests them and how does what we do meet what interests them.
Right. Well, that answers another question, but there's a part of it that I'm wondering if you can expand on. The question was, do you feel that demonstrating to school districts the benefits of exercise in the brain as an angle to promote more physical education in our schools? And you talked about that as an angle that probably does make sense when you're speaking to school boards and superintendents and principals who are coming from more of that, their goal is the academic side of it. But the part of it that I'm wondering if you can comment on is the part about promoting more physical education in our schools. Is that the direction that we should be looking toward? Is it more physical education, or is it more physical activity in areas outside of the physical education class? And maybe speak to those two things. What's the role of the physical education class, and where should we be at in terms of physical activity in general throughout the school day?
Well, one comment I'd make is I think we need to be very cautious when we do start to go into justifying PE based on brain science. I'm not a brain researcher, and it worries me that sometimes some of us start to talk about dopamine and neurons and synapses, and we're really not, I don't know about everybody else, but really I'm not very qualified to talk about that stuff. And I think we should probably limit ourselves to what we have very good evidence to show, and there's lots of evidence showing that kids who are more physically active and fitter do better in school. And so, yeah, I mean, it's okay to talk about the brain science a little bit, but we need to be very careful. Sorry, what was the other part of the question? I've forgotten the last part.
No, as far as how, the role of, physical education class as it pertains to physical activity and where it goes throughout the rest of the day.
Okay, I'm getting a little senile, I think. My thinking on that is pretty simple. It's the same as learning the piano. You have a music lesson, and then you have to practice. If you don't practice, it doesn't much matter what you do in that lesson. On the other hand, if you practice and you haven't had the lesson, it doesn't much matter what you're going to do because you aren't probably going to be practicing the way you should be practicing. So, I view the PE class as a critical time where we are preparing kids with the foundation for what they need to do to actually then practice physical activity. So I see a great relationship with the PE teacher. It provides that key foundation that, as I mentioned earlier, the physical activity proponents, someone who comes in just to teach a class, isn't going to do. I mean, the PE teacher is able to develop the relationship and show the relevance to the kids and motivate the kids. And these are very important to change anybody's behavior, especially in a world that is so increasingly sedentary and where poor food is naturally available. But they have to then have opportunities to be physically active. And it seems to me that if we just focus on what happens in our PE classes, then we're really only half doing the job, because if those kids don't then practice it, they're not, it's not going to make any difference. They'll come back a week later and they won't be any better. So, so I see a really strong relationship. The challenge, of course, and somebody probably should be asking the question, is, well, how's a PE teacher going to do this?
Right.
It's not like they sit around all day with a lot of free time and they're wondering, what shall I do? My answer to that is, I don't have a great answer, but that's something that we have to think about. And to me, I think it's perhaps a change in our job description that we have to work towards, where we are not only doing the teaching in class, but we are also doing this other part. Maybe it's similar to being a coach. You get an extra stipend for doing it. But, I mean, there are folks that are doing this there, and that's what I guess I'd like to see, is us highlighting more examples of people who are succeeding in getting kids active before school, during recess. I introducing classroom activity breaks. And then, the most important time that we're really not addressing is the after-school period between the time school finishes and the time the kids are home. There's a 2 or 3 hour break there. If we truly want to get kids physically active and healthy, that's the time we have to address. And it concerns me that much of what happens in schools after school is focused on the elite, and especially at middle school and high school level. We don't actually allow all kids to participate in activities, and in many places we actually cut kids for the very reason that they're not skilled. Yeah. Well, that's totally contrary to a society that wants to get their kids physically active and healthy. So, there's a lot of rethinking that needs to go on if we want to succeed.
Right. Before we get to our last question, people are wondering if this is available in a recorded version. When we email out your certificate of participation, you will also have a link to the recorded version of this webinar. But a lot of comments and questions and comments regarding, things going on in schools, like, the administration brings in a wellness program for the staff, but won't allow them to walk, at certain times to stay healthy. So as it relates to just change in general, a lot of people very interested in training and other information and resources for, making the changes, specific to what they're doing, in their programs, whether it's, the after-school piece or staff or activities outside of the PE class. Any advice you can give for resources for people to kind of stay abreast of things, or even to research specific things in their schools to kind of make changes and to kind of stay on top of this topic?
Well, what I think concerns me is that we, as professionals, tend to be somewhat myopic and focused on what we do in class and how to do what we do in class better. And that's perhaps my biggest concern of everything. Is I don't claim to have the right answers. I mean, what I've proposed today, I think, is a decent start. But I think we need to engage more of us in a debate and discussion of how to move forward. We really need to be thinking of where are we going to be in another 5, 10, 15 years, and how are we going to get there. I truly am concerned that with so many changes occurring fast and businesses and organizations going out of business, that we need to be thinking proactively as to where are we headed and how are we going to get there. And I think that's something that, it's not going to be a top-down thing. Certainly with Shape America, we are thinking about the future, but I think really it has to happen at every level. And to me, probably the breakthroughs are going to come through at the local level, that we are going to have some, heroes who are doing this. When I talk about getting every kid physically active, and I say every kid too, I want to emphasize that. I'm not saying just getting some of your kids physically active and healthy. I'm getting, why don't we set a target, every kid in your school? Well, I'm confident that there's somebody out there in the country who can do this. And what we need are folks who are succeeding, and we need, these stories to be promoted and for us all to learn what's working. And as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be different in different geographical, cultural environments. But I think the key thing is, of course, to at least start the discussion, and that can occur at, in the district level and the state associations, districts, our district associations, and of course at the national level. But it's a discussion that we have to have in order to be successful into the future.
Right. Well, thank you, Steve. You posed some great questions, and I think gotten folks thinking about some important topics as we move forward in the field of physical education. So thank you. And at this time,
can I just add, if I didn't answer somebody's question as well as they wanted it answered, or if you have ideas that you wanted to share, and please contact me, and you can contact me through PE Links for You or through Shape America. I'd be really interested in your thoughts. As I said, I don't don't claim to have all the answers, and I'm very interested in other people's thoughts. So thanks,
Right.
and thanks to everybody who's been here today.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Before I do announce the winner of our Achieve Middle School Physical Education curriculum, I wanted to mention to everybody to keep an eye out in their email for your certificate of participation and the announcements of the details of our next webinar topic. They do typically take place the third week of every month. I want to thank you all for joining us. So the winner of our Achieve Middle School Physical Education curriculum, valued at $699, is Geraldine Gerhardt at Hebron Schools in Indiana. So again, I thank everybody for joining us. Keep an eye out for your certificate of participation and the announcement of next month's webinar. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.